Welcome back to the show. Islam does not seek to turn its adherents into a monolithic group, but instead celebrates diversity and pluralism. This is according to traditional classical traditions. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life recently released their latest results from a survey of Muslims around the globe on religion, politics, and society. Although there is a wide variability, it seems, according to this research, that most Muslims want Sharia, which is the application of Islamic law, to be the governing law of their countries and to play an important role in the political process. Online to understand all of this, we have Mohamed Ghilan, columnist and PhD candidate in neuroscience at the University of Victoria in Canada. Mohamed Ghilan, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
Now, you've written a very interesting piece, I must say, and there's a pertinent point you bring out right at the beginning of your article, and that is the fact that nobody basically seems to be able to agree on what the term Sharia actually means. And this seems to be a sticking point, isn't it?
It is. I think it's actually a problem with the survey itself and the way it was conducted. It started off by first asking the average Muslim, do you want Sharia law? And almost instinctively, most of them, about 85% on average, said, yes, we do. But when they went down to the next level of questioning, the only questions that were asked with regards to Sharia law were, would you like to have your hand cut off if you stole, or stoned if you committed adultery? Basically, they just addressed the penal code in the way that it's applied in a place like Saudi Arabia. And as soon as they introduced that question, everybody started backing up a little bit.
Now, of course, Sharia is not purely the application of penal code. I mean, every classical scholar agrees that mercy precedes divine wrath, and that Sharia is for the benefit of society rather than otherwise. So would you say that this survey didn't even look at that?
That's true. This is actually an interesting point, because when you speak about Sharia, which is what I tried to do in this article, based on the feedback that I got, the perception in the minds of people out there, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, is focused on this idea of the penal code. And Sharia is something that transcends that. It actually covers many things. And unfortunately, the way that it's been promoted and proposed by certain countries out there, when they speak of Islamic law, the only thing they go to is the application of the penal code, because that is the most obvious thing that they can point to and say, look, this is Islamic law and this is what we're applying. But that is a myopic idea. That's not what Sharia really is about. Even the penal code itself, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said, "Idra'u al-hudud bi-shubuhat." You know, try to ward off this penal code with doubt. And that's why, if you look at the early community, the number of people who actually had this penal code applied to them, you can count them on your hand. And it was more often than not them admitting and coming in and asking for it.
I'm sure you'll also remember the degree of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh actually suspending the penal codes for theft during the time of drought and famine.
That one is a bit of a misconception. He didn't suspend the code per se in the way that is being promoted like that. The penal code itself, in order for it to be applied and to have someone receive a punishment for something, there's a number of steps that have to be taken. You have to have motive, you have to have planning, you have to have a lot of things in place. And Sayyidina Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, when he was looking at the year of the famine that he had, Am al-Ramada, a lot of these prerequisites to get to the penal code were not being fulfilled because of the situation that was going on. So he didn't suspend the ruling, he actually applied it properly, in that it didn't apply at the time.
Do you think that we need to understand these subtleties if we start using the word Sharia? And second part of the question, do you think that the word Sharia, even in Muslim circles, is used far too generically?
Definitely. There are many subtleties to this term, and just judging by the feedback that I got from some people in the way that I presented how Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, for example, when he looked at the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, and Declaration of Independence, and he just showed how it's all pretty much consistent with Islamic Sharia. I had some people come back and some Muslims, and they couldn't grasp that concept because they feel that Sharia is a simpleton type of black and white type of application that you bring in and you just apply it and that's it. And it's not the case. It's something that is far more subtle than that. And I mean, people do graduate degrees in this.
Indeed, because even the South African Constitution, if you read that document, you will also find that a lot of its clauses, in fact, agree 100% with the so-called Islamic ethos and would fit into what anybody's model of an Islamic state would be. Do you think that as citizens, particularly in minority context, I mean, you're talking from Canada, I believe, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf comes from New York, we come from South Africa, that we actually need to appreciate the fact that some so-called non-Muslim governments, they're not Sharia, they're not Muslim, but they can reflect values that we have to be satisfied with because they do run parallel to Islamic values.
This is where I bring in this idea of we really have to get past the terms and look at what underlies those terms. A lot of there's a few Muslims out there that in minority countries that call for the Sharia law to be applied and whatnot. The very fact that they're able to speak up, have this freedom of speech, to demand what they're demanding, to do all these things, this is actually based on Islamic principles of freedom, liberty. And the country they're living in is allowing them this opportunity based on principles they arrived at, but it's also principles that Islam would approve of. And this is where I quoted Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who said that the intellect was created by God and the Sharia was revealed by God, and He's not going to give us a Sharia that contradicts the intellect. So Muslims really need to come to terms with the idea that not everything that comes from non-Muslims is automatically un-Islamic.
That certainly is an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, do you think that we have to acknowledge the fact, and it is a fact, that universal values are always going to remain the same, and that stuff that comes from Quranic and Sunnah sources are also very often going to reflect these universal values?
Well, this is the idea of the fitrah, that natural, innate nature of the human being that God has created us with and put us on earth with. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says that al-Islam deen al-fitra, that Islam is the religion of that innate nature, it's not a surprising thing when you reflect on the South African Constitution or the US Constitution or any of these constitutions to see that by fitra people are arriving at certain conclusions that it's not a surprise that Islam would agree with. But the terms, as soon as you start throwing labels and things, people start to forget what the underlying concepts are and what they're actually what the objective behind it is, and they start rejecting things just out of ignorance. And so we have non-Muslims that hear the term Sharia, but because of the way that it's been presented to them with the penal code and everything, they just reject it because all they see when they see Sharia is Saudi Arabia and beheadings and cutting of the hands and lashing women for being raped, for example. On the other hand, you have Muslims that see what the West has to offer, and without even examining it, they reject that because they just assume they're non-Muslims, so everything that comes from them is kufr, it's un-Islamic. And that we have to really get beyond that and start to just talk about what underlies all of these things, and we'll find that we actually share a lot of things in common.
And those are the words of our special guest, Mohamed Ghilan, columnist and PhD candidate in neuroscience at the University of Victoria, Canada. We're currently talking about the word Sharia and a certain research by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life releasing the latest results from a survey and saying that most Muslims want Sharia or Islamic law, problem being that this term has been extremely poorly defined. Mohammed, stay online. We're going to take a quick break. Back after this.
Sure then.
Small appliance promotion is now on at ShopRite. Get an ACE 2-bar heater for only $129.99. Price is valid till Sunday, 9th of June. ShopRite. Lower prices you can trust. Always.
Ching, ching, change. It's never been so easy to get foreign exchange than it is today. At Global Foreign Exchange, we offer competitive exchange rates and commission structure on foreign cash, traveler's checks, drafts, telegraphic transfers, and cash passport cards. We even deliver free to your office. Contact Global Foreign Exchange today on 021-418-0631-2 or 4, or visit us online at globalforeignexchange.co.za. We are conveniently located in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban. Global Foreign Exchange, the right kind of change.
This is Voice of the Cape Drive Time. Going places, getting there.
Welcome back to the show. Islam does not seek to turn its adherents into a monolithic group, but instead celebrates diversity and pluralism. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life recently released their latest results from a survey of Muslims around the world on religion, politics, and society. And in spite of a wide variance, it declared that most Muslims want Sharia, or so-called Islamic law, to be the governing law of their countries and to play an important role in the political process. Questions about that poll is the whole simplification, in fact, oversimplification of the word Sharia. Online, chatting to us about that is Mohamed Ghilan, columnist, PhD candidate at the University of Victoria in Canada. Now, Mohamed, I've noticed that you have quoted a lot of classical scholars, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Qayyim, who was a student of one of the scholars that a lot of extremists like to quote, Ibn Aqil, and so on and so on. Do you think that perhaps the core of the problem is that in this day and age, too few of us know too little about classical tradition, which is about tolerance and is about diversity?
This is definitely the case. It's quite surprising I get surprised on a daily basis when I open up these classical texts and read what some of these scholars that are being quoted even by extremists, what they actually had to say in context and in full statements, rather than taking sound bites from them. And it's quite shocking to see how much tolerance they had, how much foresight they had, and how much they thought about the higher objectives of the sacred law. Not that they stopped at the text in itself and forgot about what its intention was. And this is the problem today. What a lot of Muslims do is they take these classical works, and they actually warned, even in the classical works, they warned against taking their words verbatim. They had a methodology in how they took the Quran and the Sunnah, the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, and how they approached it and how they interpreted it. And that's what they emphasized in their works. Modern Muslims go to their works, they're medieval scholars, they were dealing with completely different contextual realities, and they try to take their statements and apply them today, which makes Islam quite irrelevant at that point. But if someone were to take the whole context of everything that they said, you will come up with a very different conclusion.
It's interesting you make that point, because if one looks at Imam al-Ghazali, radiallahu anhu, for example, when he talks about siyasa or political governance, he actually mentions in the text, it's there, he says he doesn't expect the ulama to rule the country, they have their role, but he actually says one needs experts in municipal matters, experts in health, and that kind of stuff. That's his construction of society. How important do you think that is? But do you think we need to remind ourselves of this?
It's quite important. I mean, one of the scholars, I fail to remember his name right now, I think it was Imam Malik, he said it was more beloved to him to have someone who is not a pious Muslim lead a country, as opposed to who is good in politics and knows how to run a country, as opposed to a pious Muslim who knows nothing about these things. Because the pious Muslim, his worship, his acts of devotion benefits himself, but his inexperience, his inability to run the country will now harm all of society. Whereas on the other hand, the impious Muslim, the one who's not really observant as well as he should, that's on him, but his managerial work, his expertise will now benefit everyone. So the scholars always balance these two things, and they recognize that, I mean, even the scholars, once they start getting involved with politics, and we see this today, if you look at Egypt, for example, one of the reasons that a lot of Azhari scholars, and even the previous mufti, a lot of people did not have much trust in him, was because they said, well, he's appointed by the government. He's obviously part of the political body, and he must have some ulterior motives, and we don't know if we're getting the true religion anymore. All of these might have been a little bit superstitious accusations of him, because if you examine what he did, he was not really influenced by politics, but nevertheless, his involvement with it was a problem. So the ulama always said, our job is to come and advise, but everybody has an expertise and that person needs to be placed in his position.
Do you think that what's needed right now is some kind of leadership towards holistic scholarship, not exactly Sharia centric, but in the sense of us Muslims understanding contemporary society around us with the lenses that we are given, the lenses of Quran, the lenses of Sunnah, the lenses of Ijtihad, and all that kind of stuff? Your take on that?
It's interesting you bring that point up because I was just discussing this with another student the other day, and we live in a day and age where reductionism has taken over, and everybody feels that they cannot step outside of their field of study. Whereas if you look at the previous scholars, the classical scholars that I've even quoted in my article, most of them were philosophers, political theorists, Islamic jurists. Some were even physicians, like in the case of Ibn Rushd. I mean, they wore many hats, and that allowed them to see with a much wider lens, through the Islamic lens, through the Quran and the Sunnah, to see how the world functions. And nowadays, we're missing that in a grave way. People really need, if you want to study Islam, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to master the Islamic tradition, in conjunction with it, you must also study politics, sociology, anthropology, and science even, so that you can get this holistic vision of what Islam is all about. If we're talking about a religion where Allah says in the Quran that He has completed the religion for us, it's not restricted to just a couple of classical texts that people read. People need to be relevant, contemporary, read up on everything, and get educated on how the world functions, the global world today, how it's working out, so that they can bring in something more relevant from an Islamic perspective to society.
Do you think that one of the barriers to this is an innate fear, that people are feared of venturing into what they might even regard as the unknown? Do you think that as Muslims worldwide, particularly in minority context, we need to get rid of, number one, our ghetto mentality, number two, our inferiority complex?
Most definitely. This inferiority complex is something very prevalent right now. And you see it even, I mean, the one thing that I see all the time is with science. I mean, a lot of Muslims like to bring in the Quran and speak about scientific miracles of the Quran, which is something I'm completely against, because I think you should just go to the lab and do the actual science. You don't have to assume that it's in the Quran and not step out there and start venturing. And it is a fear. And unfortunately, there are a handful of scholars in the classical tradition that would warn people against studying certain things. Studying logic, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, studying philosophy. People were afraid of studying these things because they felt, oh, you'll become a heretic, which is not really the Islamic approach to any of this. Our scholars, Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, Imam al-Ghazali, they delved into these things. And Imam al-Ghazali, in his Deliverance from Error, he said, I delved into it, the delving of a brave man who goes into the ocean, swimming in, and I just took it all, and we ended up with Hujjat al-Islam out of him. He's the proof of Islam because he had this the incoherence of the philosophers published that nobody was able to refute afterwards. So Muslims really need to get that spirit of the classical scholarship where they didn't fear anything when it comes to knowledge. Just go out there and start investigating it. But the catch here is that they have to first understand their classical texts first. You first have to master your own aqidah, your own theology, understand where Islam stands on many issues, and then you can go out there and start studying everything else.
Mohamed, our final question, as far as all of this is concerned, do you think at least the encouraging thing is that in the year 2013 we're beginning to discuss this? Surely that's going to be positive.
This is definitely a positive fact, and I hope that more Muslims would. I mean, I'm lucky, I feel blessed that I'm in a position where Allah has guided me to some wonderful teachers who got me in touch with the classical tradition, and I'm studying in the traditional method, as well as studying in a secular university in a secular context, and I'm bringing these two things together. I wish more young Muslims would do that type of hybridization of classical with modern knowledge, so that we can start discussing these things more and more in a knowledgeable way, in a balanced way, in an Islamic way.
Mohamed Ghilan, PhD candidate in neuroscience, columnist at the University of Victoria, Canada, showing that scholarship is a polymath indulgence. We have to learn absolutely everything. And Mohamed Ghilan, everything of the best with all of your studies. You sound extremely busy, and thanks for your very, very interesting words on Voice of the Cape Drive Time. May you go from success to success, inshallah.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the visit. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.